Welcome to Lunch with Tech Leaders, where we have engaging conversations about software development and cloud engineering with industry leaders and subject matter experts. These episodes are created by the Great Lakes Tech Leaders, an online community of technology practitioners. Please come join the conversation by visiting gltl.rbn.ai. Again, that's gltl.rbn.ai. Now strap in, because we're deploying to production in 3, 2, 1.
To the latest episode of Lunch with Tech Leaders. My name is Adam Oberhausen. I'm the Vice President of Customer Solutions with Right Brain Networks, and I'm your host for today. Joining me today is Lancelot Carlson, co-founder of HealPay and AI enthusiast and all-around great guy. Say hi, Lance.
Hi, everyone.
Our other co-host, Tom Kowalski, MIA, AWOL, not sure. Hopefully he's okay. Hopefully he's not frozen. But yeah, if he joins and hops in, great. If not, it's just you and I, Lance. Are we going to be able to do this on our own?
Oh, I'm fully confident we are. That's what Agile's about, right? No planning?
Exactly. So yeah, this episode, we're going to continue our discussion on Agile practices. We're going to dive deeper into the mechanics and best practices of executing on your iterations, commonly referred to as sprints. I don't like the word sprint, so I'm using the word iteration. Last time we talked about kind of some high-level Agile stuff, kind of how it helps you manage projects, talked about velocity charts, burn-down charts. There was some debate about how valuable they are. But all around, I thought it was a great conversation, so I'm excited to dive in more here.
Yeah, me too.
So I'd like to start with iteration 0, which is usually the first iteration of any new project, software development project. So it's a foundational phase. It's usually referred to as like a preparatory step. It lays the groundwork for the project. We're going to talk about some of the mechanics and best practices of that, including the INVEST criteria, which is a new acronym I wasn't familiar with, and which is a tool for effective user stories. But usually the iteration 0 starts with a kickoff meeting where the project vision is shared. This helps align the team and the goals and the scope. It's meant to have open discussion, clarify expectations, and just really setting the tone. Iteration 0 should focus on the development team establishing their development environment, selecting their tools, assuring everyone has access, and everyone's comfortable with the technology and platforms that will be used. This stage usually involves sketching out a high-level design and architectural plan, kind of define some of those key components and how they'll interact within the system. It shouldn't be an exhaustive, every little detail sorted out, because, you really just want to understand the direction you're going and begin working.
Is it like, what does that encompass? What's the scope of that? Is it like, we're choosing Ruby on Rails, we're choosing MVC, we're using Postgres, or is it like the application is a to-do list application? Like what? How far down the scope does it go?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. I don't know if I have the right answer. I think we can, from what the research I did for the show is, it did touch on those things, like what are we going to use a particular framework? What language is this going to be written in? Yeah, where's it going to be hosted? I think what stuck out to me the most is, from an architecture perspective, you want to defer these decisions as long as possible. Like, right, you don't want to set something in stone on iteration 0 if you're unsure of it. So, yes, you obviously need to pick a language. You need to set a repo, but you don't necessarily need to decide what framework you're going to use, because once you decide a framework, you're kind of locked in. You're in a marriage with that framework. So that leads to the next part of this, which is iteration 0, is you should be creating that initial product backlog for iteration 0, which involves drafting the stories. When I did the research for the show, I came across this effective acronym for defining user stories, which is the INVEST acronym. Have you ever heard of this, Lance?
Never.
Okay, yeah, me neither. I've been doing Agile for a long time. Never heard of this.
Yeah.
So INVEST. I'll run through it real quickly. Oh, I'm getting a ping from Tom. Okay, I'll tell him to join when he can. Got a fire at work. We've all been there. So INVEST. I stands for independent. Each story should stand alone with minimal dependencies to facilitate flexible planning and implementation. I think that makes a lot of sense. You don't want your stories to be codependent on each other. They should be able to kind of be assigned without any particular order. I think a lot of development teams, when they look at things, they're like, well, first we got to do login because everything else is dependent on login. But you don't necessarily need to do login first. You can mock login. You can demonstrate functionality of the system without having. Oh, looks like Tom's here. You can demonstrate functionality of the system without maybe having some of those initial things like a database schema in place or even a login in place. Next on that is the letter N, which is negotiable. User stories are not rigid contracts, but rather starting points for discussion. They should leave room for adjustment and refinement. So yeah, it makes a lot of sense to me. Feel free to comment on any of these, Lance, or chime in, but yeah. Next up is V for valuable. Every story must provide value to the end user or customers. If a story doesn't contribute to the user's needs or project's goals, it should be reevaluated or scrapped. Hey, Tom.
Howdy.
We got every story should be estimable. That's a word I'd never heard of. I think it's a real word, estimable. The team should be able to estimate the effort required for a story. If a story is too vague to estimate, it needs to be broken down or clarified. Next in this acronym is the letter S, small. Stories should be small enough to be comfortably completed within an iteration. I think that's, I remember that kind of being a thing. You don't want, you want to be able to get things done within the sprint. You don't want things to kind of carry over and roll over to the next iteration. Sorry. And the last letter in the acronym INVEST is the letter T, testable. Each story should have clear acceptance criteria to enable effective testing and ensure that it meets objectives. So Tom, welcome to the show. We're talking about iteration 0, and I'm going to post it in the channel so people can see that acronym. I came across this acronym about defining user stories, which is this acronym called INVEST, and I had never heard of it. I thought it was interesting. Thought I'd share it with the audience and my co-host here.
The testing is interesting. Nothing about automated testing or, it's just acceptance test criteria. It's kind of interesting.
So I don't know if I've actually ever participated in what the team called an iteration 0. I'm trying to think if when I was doing Agile, Scrum, if I ever worked with a team that was like, okay, this is iteration 0, this is sprint 0. Here's what we're basically trying to come up with a game plan to get started on the actual project. I feel like in most of my experience, it was always like you just had some really long meetings to kind of hammer all this stuff out. I don't really recall.
They're usually strung together, right? It's usually you're planning or doing the iterations as part of previous sprints.
Yeah. Other parts of the iteration 0 is just identifying risk in the project. There's always tons of unknowns. The team should be discussing potential roadblocks and challenges and develop strategies to mitigate them. It's also a chance for the team to get to know each other, right? There could be bringing a bunch of new people together. This is, it's ideally you want the team members to form a bond, understand their working styles, align on their communication and collaboration methods. Because obviously if a team that works well together is more likely to navigate the complexities of a project and delivering value. So that's what I got on iteration 0.
What is your thought on a senior developer doing some of that first before bringing in the rest of the team?
I would not be opposed to it. I do think it's always easier to... I always like someone to bring me a draft of something. I don't care if it's garbage. Just bring me something to work with, because it's always, the way I work, it's always easier to have a straw man proposal. That just means, just throw together some junk, throw together some ideas, and that at least gets people talking, moving in the right direction. I don't think I've ever experienced a case where someone brought some of that pre-work to the table and it totally derailed the project. It seems like it always kind of provides value. So I'm for it. What's your take on it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of times projects, if there's too many people in the beginning planning stages, I feel like it just takes too long to get started sometimes. And like, at least from my experience with starting new projects, if you just get one person to that's senior level to just ramp up and, think about what this project means as a whole, picks the stack, picks, everything, and just kind of builds a small prototype that everyone can then start to participate in after the fact, it's usually gone faster and, to get people going, because one person's just started making decisions, whereas a team sitting together, talking about everything and hashing things out, everyone has their opinions about things, and it just
grind to a halt.
Yeah.
I feel like Shape Up, which your team uses, kind of addresses this, right? Because when you shape up the project before you actually present it to the delivery team, right? It's kind of already partially baked. It could even include a POC, like you said.
Well, we can create a cycle 0 too, and there's something called an R&D pitch. So you can instead of actually having it be a real pitch with real scope on an existing project, you can do R&D. You can make that as long as you want, within the realm of 2 to 6 weeks. And that could be sort of a micro sprint if you're trying to research something. Maybe they're building a prototype for something, or they're literally setting up the project because it's new, and some developer has to work on getting everything in place and researching dependencies. And
yeah. So moving on, we get through that iteration 0, and then we're going to come to the first day of the first iteration, which again starts with an iteration planning meeting. So I'm gonna use a narrative to talk about some characters that are in this meeting. All teams are different. There might not be these people in the meeting, but just to kind of demonstrate the essence of it. So, the project manager opens the meeting, with some excitement about we're going to kick this project off, and he turns over the conversation to a business analyst who has a set of stories that she believes could be tackled in this first iteration. This business analyst might be a product manager, whoever. And then, that this business analyst is looking for the developers that are on the delivery team to, give a estimate on their capacity for the iteration. So let's say in this example, the developers say, we think we can do 15 story points this week. We're going to do weekly iterations. And the business analyst, wants to take a more ambitious view and presents a list that is 22 story points, right? And so this is really the essence of the meeting, where, the two parties are going to discuss and debate what's realistically achievable. And it really highlights a fundamental aspect of Agile planning, which is that estimates are not promises or targets. They're just informed guesses. So when you're planning these iterations, you have to accommodate the realities of development. If a team says they think they can do 15 points, if a product manager or a project manager says, well, I need you guys to do 25 points, all that's going to happen is that the team's going to inflate their pointing scale. And so it's really, the amount of points that a team thinks they can do really shouldn't be negotiable, or else you're just going to inflate the points to the point where every week the team's velocity appears like it's going up because they're just inflating their points.
Have you seen that meme where they have the junior developer on the top and then the senior developer on the bottom? The junior developer is like, the spec is like really long, and they're just like, yeah, I can do all of that. And then in short a period of time, and then the senior developer, it's like this really simple fix, and they're like 6 months.
Yes, I think I have. So what's important is that when you're having this discussion with, your product managers and your delivery team members, is that you have to prioritize the work that provides the highest business value at the lowest cost, right? So I'm going to post a little hand-drawn graphic I made that kind of illustrates how you think about this. Doesn't seem to be working. Copy, no. Paste, no. It's a quadrant graph where in the lower left-hand corner you have low cost but high value. So that's in the lower left-hand corner. And those are basically cheap and valuable items, right? Those are the things you want to do first. If you move to the right, in the lower right-hand quadrant, you got items in your backlog that are cheap and valueless. So yeah, they're easy to do, but they don't really provide any value to the user. So it's kind of like meh, like probably don't do those, don't prioritize those. If you move up in the quadrant to the upper right quadrant, you've got high cost and low value. So these are expensive to implement and they provide little to no value. So these are your don't do them at all quadrant. And then you've got your upper left quadrant, which is high cost, high value. So it's expensive to implement, but it's also very valuable to the business. So that's probably going to be in the do it later, or, let's get the initial MVP out and then, tackle some of these harder to implement value adds. I think we've probably all seen flavors of that chart or talked about them. So I did want to just highlight it. And I do think it's important when you're having these discussions as a team to figure out, what is the ROI on the things that you're implementing. And it's also important to note that as we're only on iteration 1 here. So this backlog is not it. The backlog in new stories are always going to emerge as you work through your iterations. There's going to be new stories. There's going to be new feedback from customers. There's going to be all sorts of things that can keep adding to that backlog. So there's going to be more items that provide that low cost, high value as you work through your iterations. And, obviously a project does not conclude when every story is completed. Project concludes typically when the remaining stories no longer justify the effort. Which I think is an interesting concept to think about.
I'm just thinking about, the initial project, because it's a new project. If it's a lot of times if it's a full-on app, you have to build out the authentication, you have to build out all these other extra things. So it's like, there's going to be in the very beginning, there's going to be a lot of high value, high cost things, but you have to get through them. Otherwise, you're not really delivering any value to the user yet. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
For me, is the mic better?
Yeah.
I'm all about that, the transparency and communication between the teams, defining what that value is, who, and who the customer is, especially. Maybe it's internal, maybe it's external. If it's a team that is delegating this project down, right? I don't know where the business manager is or the analyst in your scenario here, but if they're on a separate team, it needs to be clearly defined. Are you transferring the external customer's value responsibility to that team? Are they responsible for making sure that it is valuable to those customers, right? It's working for them and, they're happy? Or is that other team that assigned it, are they the customer, right? Is that team just a contractor building? And I feel like that has to be clearly defined, and what those requirements are, who the customer is for each of these teams. And I think that's where it kind of breaks down. It's kind of like, implied, implicit shared, but it needs to be, explicit on what those, responsibilities are of each team. And I feel like you have to have that before, you get to wishy-washy of what the teams are. And you say like you're building value, but you're just actually working off of, to an external customer, but you're just working off of a backlog to appease who delegated that work to you. So I think you have to clearly define that. And then on the value and prioritization, it's tricky. It's because you don't want it to be too complicated. I was just researching this too the other day on Rice and other ways of prioritizing value, because you don't want it to. That's a very simple model that you did, right? It doesn't take into dependencies and time, right? Because things cost more over time and value changes over time. So, those are just two bigger factors to add to that matrix. And then there's, a lot more, what is value to people? It's, sometimes easier to put in dollar amounts, but sometimes it's not that. So yeah, those are my thoughts on those.
Yeah. Good feedback, Tom.
Yeah. And you don't even want to involve you do kind of, it's interesting because, so sprint, that's a supercharged word, right? Everyone has different feelings about it, but the purpose of the sprint, it's actually more useful in the beginning of a project, because the whole purpose of it was to, let's see if we can build a prototype as fast as possible and get user feedback from it. So, especially when we don't know, we do know who the user is, maybe we don't know who the user is. Maybe we think we know who the user is, but we're still trying to figure out a sort of more specific version of the user, right? And so we need to do more testing. And a lot of times that shouldn't involve, a developer until you're ready to prototype or build out a prototype and you really know, okay, this is the person I want to test. I actually have access to this physical person or whatever in some form, and I can get feedback from it quickly. So that's the purpose of a sprint. And, so you can enter a project from different amounts of information that you already have on hand. Obviously, the more information you have about the user ahead of time, the more successful that project's going to be. But if you don't have it, then you're still stuck in R&D and prototype land.
Yeah, just to kind of put a cap on the iteration planning, is a rule of thumb is there should be 10 minutes of planning per day of the iteration. So if you're at a 1 week iteration, that's 50 minutes, about an hour should be about an hour meeting for the iteration planning. I know that's very tough for a lot of teams. I've seen teams spend 4 hours in a iteration planning. Obviously, if you go to a 2 week sprint or even 4 week, the length of that meeting increases dramatically. So I've always been a fan of the 1 week iteration. I think it's time boxed enough to move the needle, get things done, and then you're not kind of dreading the 2 hour meetings or the long drudgery of meetings.
You can shorten those iteration meetings by having everything, like in the shape up methodology. Each pitch is really well formatted, well planned ahead of time. It's been just heavily discussed with a developer and with the product person ahead of time. And so by the time it reaches the iteration, it's like a kind of Bezos likes this. You have to bring the agenda to the meeting. Everything has to be written down, and the meeting should be shorter because, everyone has reviewed all of the things that are going to be in the iteration, and now we're just sort of deciding what's priority. So you can definitely shorten those meetings if all of the scope is heavily planned beforehand.
I actually like the
should be for information transfer, right? The meeting, it should be for discussion, right?
Exactly.
It should be asynchronous as much as possible beforehand.
%.
Yeah, I like some of Amazon's policies around meetings. Like, you can't do slide presentations. Everything has to be like a written document. You're expected to be able to digest like 6 pages of a document, and just no slide decks, I think, is interesting for meetings and that sort of thing. But don't want to go off on that tangent. So we've done the iteration planning. Now the team begins the work. A lot of times there could be breakout sessions where developers need to talk about some design decisions. There could be some whiteboarding, really just brainstorming about, how we're going to implement these stories, if there's anything left to kind of figure out. From there, sorry for all my ums. What's interesting about this is that with Agile, stories aren't assigned to a specific individual, right? The team is kind of supposed to self-organize. So there's a bunch of stories that have been picked for this iteration. The team should be self-organizing in chosen by the developers, not assigned. And I think that helps kind of shepherd that culture of accountability, trust. I don't know if I've ever worked in a agile project where like the project manager or someone on our team lead physically assign the stories to individuals. I'm sure it could work, but I've never seen it. So
it's like Kanban.
Yeah. The other thing that I think is common is you'll see sometimes they take a team member will take a user story and break that up even further into tasks for that particular story, and then put in the number of hours for each task. So it's kind of breaking up a story even further just to kind of break it down even further so you know exactly what you're doing on the hour. I've seen that in some cases. I don't typically prefer that. I feel like the story itself should have enough to know what needs to be implemented. So yeah, moving on to continuing the execution of the iteration. You have to think about your duty cycle in an iteration. So if we have a 1 week iteration, that first day of the iteration is planning, the planning meeting, design, architecture, initial setup. So that's a half day. On the end of the iteration, you're going to probably do a demonstration, a retrospective, and that could eat up another potentially half a day. So that takes your actual work duty cycle down to 4 days. So you're at an 80% duty cycle where you actually be spent working, and the other 20% is planning and cleaning up. So you should kind of think about that when you're planning. The other crucial component of Agile is that your iterations are consistent. It can be very tempting to extend an iteration by a day or two so that you can get things done, but that really throws off your cadence. It throws off your velocity charts and your burn down charts. It would make it appear like you're getting more done than you actually could, and it just throws off your entire cadence. Of course, we've got the daily stand-up, which is very common in Agile practices. And the daily stand-up includes the 3 questions. What did you do yesterday? What will you do today? And what obstacles are in your way? These meetings are supposed to be succinct and to the point. There shouldn't be any other chatter or talking about other things. If there's more discussion, it should be done separately outside of the stand-up. It's really just to identify blockers and make sure everyone's humming along.
What do you think about asynchronous versus synchronous stand-ups?
I've done asynchronous through a Slack bot, and I thought it was pretty cool. Like everyone enters their information, and then there was that quick meeting, and you really only need to touch base on the blockers or breakout sessions that are needed. You introduced me to the asynchronous stand-up, Tom.
Yeah, you do have to have, like constraints around it. It can't just be like free for all. It's, because the idea is to identify those blockers and, address them in, the timely manner. So if it's like, off, and when you say you have a blocker, right, some people are reporting at night and, some people in the morning, right? So as long as you're all on the same page and on how that's done and it's working for you, yeah, definitely.
We actually have reduced it to Monday check-in and Friday checkout.
Per the shape-up methodology, yes. Right? Yeah. So another new concept, which I've never done in practice that I came across for the researching the show here, is the midpoint check-in of the iteration. So at the midpoint of your iteration, which would be a Wednesday in our 1 week iteration, Wednesday after lunch, there's 2 things that should be in place. All automated acceptance tests should be ready for execution. If they're not ready, then developers might need to assist the QA, assuming if there's a distinct role between QA and development, that we need to get the automated tests ready. If developers consistently have to assist QA in that practice, it could mean there's an imbalance in the team structure. Second piece of this is that the team reviews the completed stories. So if the points accumulated at the Wednesday mark are significantly off from the expected halfway mark, it's a sign that you should recalibrate and revise the workload. So like say you had 10 points for this iteration and it's Wednesday and you guys only have 2 that are done. Agile is about telling the bad news as early and as frequently as possible. So if you're halfway through the iteration and you're way off course, you should be having those conversations within your team, with your stakeholders to say, hey, we've only got 2 of our expected 10 done. What do you want us to focus on to make sure that we get done this iteration? Because the last thing you want to do is end an iteration with, things partially completed. It's much better to focus on what provides the most value and get those things done. There's also the flip side of that. It could be Wednesday and you have 8 points done, and you would need to communicate with your business analyst. A lot of teams just manage their own backlog, so they would just know exactly what they need to pull in. So if you're ahead of schedule, that is not, you shouldn't just kind of coast in for the rest of this, for the iteration. You should be looking to add and figure out in your retrospective why you're able to achieve a higher velocity. And maybe something's happening with the team or with the environment or with the project in general that things are speeding up. Usually after the first few iterations, you will see an increase in speed because those first few iterations are slow. You're getting your environment stood up. You're trying to get an automated testing framework in place and that sort of thing. So, but you will see a plateau in your velocity at some point. So I thought that was interesting. I'd never heard of the midpoint check-in and kind of actually reevaluating where the sprint's at and kind of making some decisions right in the middle of your sprint on what you should get done versus what's feasible to get done versus what's not.
Wayne made an interesting comment about accounting for holidays and iterations and Monday and Friday ceremonies. It is interesting. Like I know every year around the end of the year, that last cycle gets a little bit messed up because so you can't expect too much of people in those iterations, right? So obviously, if you're doing weekly iterations, you can probably adjust for that a little faster, maybe. So it's just a matter of kind of doing some pre-planning on that. And then definitely Monday, Friday, like understanding that those days are kind of days that maybe you won't get as much done just because Friday people. Yeah, exactly. Yes.
And then, being aware of when people are taking time off in general, like you got a doctor's appointment, you're taking a vacation day, all those things should be kind of accounted for in your iteration planning. I want to get what you guys think about what I said in terms of like the midpoint check-in. Point number 1 was all of the automated QA tests should be, ready to go. All automated acceptance tests should be ready for execution. Have you guys ever heard of such a practice or seen anything like that in practice?
You mean ahead of time? You write the test first?
Yeah, I'm just saying, like, they're ready for the developer because you can't call it done. You can't call something done until it's passed all of the acceptance criteria, which includes all the automated tests. So, if it's Thursday and the developer has his code written, but there's no acceptance test for him to run against it, it can't be done. So I think what my research for the show was like all automated acceptance tests should be ready for execution by the midpoint of the sprint of the iteration.
Where are these coming from?
Who's writing that?
This one is from my hero, Uncle Bob, Robert Martin.
It's like a separate
who's
team
writing
these tests, right? Yeah,
exactly.
It doesn't matter, right? It can either be the QA person on the delivery team or it's a developer on the delivery team. Like,
it's a delivery
you have
team.
to have, yeah.
Yeah, it's not some external team handy.
Yeah, not some external team.
Okay.
No. It's all delivery team controls the entire project, right? No external factors.
I think that ceremony, is good. I think too much, or ceremony can be good. Too much ceremony can be bad. Too much structure can be bad, right? You're just sort of dictating, you must do it this way. But as long as I feel like as long as your acceptance tests are getting written and are getting pushed into production, then caring about whether or not they're done by the midpoint is maybe a little bit, I don't know, micromanaging.
Yeah, I think Wayne points it out in the chat too. It's like if they're using test-driven design, then yes, your tests should be in place before you have the code. So it's really about what process you have. I came from my early days of development when we started doing Agile Scrum. There was no QA, there was no unit tests, there was no automated tests. The developers had to write their code and then manually test it, and then it went out for release. It wasn't the best system, but it's how it was, right? So that was the process. So I think it's a good call out by Wayne that if you're following test-driven design, you should have those tests at least stubbed out or ready to be executed prior to the actual code that is, doing that, providing that business value.
Like you're either writing the BDD tests in their DSL and just the actual test implementation isn't completed, but the spec is there. Is that what we're saying? Or you have an abstraction layer like Cucumber where it's just the actual specification with natural language assertions that you actually make work later.
Mm-hmm.
I'm okay with that, I suppose.
Yeah.
I think you're
Adam,
mixing in like the implementation, right? Yeah, with Agile. I feel like when you're talking about Agile, you should do it without saying QA or developer or anything like that, right? Or tests, or it should be, it's that the framework of communication, or and allowing how you organize, but it shouldn't be tied to any specific technologies or processes internal of what you're delivering, through the Agile process. That's my thought on that. When you start talking about testing and handing off to QA and developers, it's like that. None of that should matter. None of that has to do with Agile. I feel I don't know, with the internal, how your team is operating, implementing, versus the Agile is kind of like that buffer of how you communicate that to the external stakeholders and progress. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think for the sake of the show, we are trying to kind of explore how an actual delivery team would execute on an iteration. So we have to take some, we have to talk about some of this stuff. I get what you're saying, but I think
it's got to be, I get it. It's got to be clear though, I feel, right? When you start, there's like, handing to the QA, right? Or the test should be written. Like when we, Lance and I have the confusion of where are these tests coming from, right? I think it's got to be like, okay, within your team to help with the Agile process, you should have tests here by this point, right? To check your velocity and things like that. If you're doing this,
is Uncle Bob labeling what kind of Agile? Is he like, this is Scrum, or is this just Uncle Bob's thing?
This is just like Uncle Bob's thing. Okay. Robert Martin, for those who don't know who Uncle Bob is, contributor to the Agile Manifesto. So I do want to talk about a few more things before we wrap up here. We've got release planning with Agile. And I think that's like every user story should be deployable if you're calling it done, right? It should be in a state where it can be deployed. For business reasons, they might not want you to deploy everything right away as it's done, right? They might want to, they've got a backlog, and sometimes there's a line in the backlog that says this is the line of we need all this done before we ship. Obviously, it's good to deploy things even if it's behind a feature flag as soon as possible, just to make sure your mechanics of deploying work and you can test things behind a feature flag without actually exposing it to the public and all that good stuff. But I do think it's interesting to think about that, business analyst, product manager, usually there is some kind of line in the sand of where they want to get things to a point of saying this is ready for quote unquote release. But even though as developers, we should be always thinking about this thing should be deployable if we're calling the story done.
What do you mean? It works on my machine.
Yeah, exactly.
And again, I think it comes down to who is your customer, right? Is this a team that is just writing code and handing it off these features to another team that owns the value to the external customer? Then maybe it's different. But ideally, you'd like to delegate that value that you're trying to give to those customers, whether it's a certain persona or, depending on how big your team is, right? Or how big the product is, company determines how niche that gets broken down. But it should be clear, right? Ideally, a team should own a certain customer value, externally, end to end. It doesn't always happen. Depends on how big the app is. Things to be broken up. But I think, again, you need to make that clear distinction, right? If you're talking, some companies, it is treated like we're just writing code and here you go, I'm delivering it to this other team or some little piece of this or that. But if it is external and in that case, if your customers are internal, you're delivering that by that date that you're giving them. If your customers are external, then that value is to your customers and you do need to deliver it by then for your sprint. I think that's kind of where that difference is.
Few other things I want to touch on, which is sometimes you don't know what you don't know, right? And there's actually a term in Agile for that. When you're faced with stories that are difficult to estimate, they have the term called spike story. And the idea is a spike is a thin, sharp, piercing object that can you pierce through the core of a problem, you investigate, and then you report back on what you actually think it's going to take to get this thing done. I think the other term I've used that I've used is exploratory stories. You kind of put a time box around how long you're going to investigate this. And then you can, at the beginning of the next iteration, you say, oh yeah, I dove pretty deep into this challenge and I think it's going to take us, X amount of story points to actually do what we need to do here. The other thing I wanted to touch on, which I think we touched on earlier, is the ideal shape for a velocity curve, which is a velocity curve should remain pretty flat throughout the course of a project. A rising curve in your velocity indicates inflated estimates due to external pressure, because story points are like a currency. They can be inflated. And so what's a good practice is to, on one of your first iterations, is establish the baseline story of like everything we're going to estimate for the duration of this project will be relative to this story. So that way it kind of becomes your guiding light of 8 iterations down the road. You should be thinking about that initial story that you said, well, that's a 3-pointer. So how are we currently pointing things relative to what we decided in the initial phases of the project? That's one way to avoid inflation. The other flip side of that is you could see a declining curve in your velocity chart. And that would be a sign that you're accumulating lots of technical debt or declining code quality. So you're not refactoring, you don't have automated tests, you're just trying to move as fast as you can, you're sloppy, and eventually you kind of grind your ability to be productive to a halt because you decided to take a bunch of shortcuts that are now, basically limiting your ability to be productive.
I thought that was interesting that Wayne was saying about how much of observing the velocity impacts the team's behavior after the fact. Does it steer it?
Yeah, it should be just a dose of reality. Like you shouldn't get emotional about it. It's if you're in a professional environment, Agile is about delivering the hard, cold truths every iteration so that the stakeholders are well aware, well ahead of time about where the project's at, and so that they can make decisions about what's the highest value you need to get into the product so that you can ship something. I think as humans, it's very easy to get emotional and, well, what if we just worked extra hours, or what if we worked over the weekend? But, that's pretty much, crunch time culture, toxic culture. You're going to get a lot of burnout. You're going to get employees leaving. Seems like it's a very common practice in the video game industry, where they have that crunch time culture, but I've never personally experienced it. I would probably avoid it like the plague.
Do you find that you've never been on a team where the stakeholders were maybe too pushy and expected too much, and were just not aware of the fact that development takes time. And
Yeah, I've definitely been there. I'm not sure.
Feel like that's all of that. Just experience,
That's what
right?
I thought. I was thinking that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I do think that at some degree, stakeholders do need more pushback than they typically get. But
I did want to circle back to Wayne's question about other methodologies. Are there things outside of Agile? I mean, I think it's all these different flavors of Agile. Like you've got Scrum, you've got Kanban. We've talked about an emerging discipline called Shape Up, which Lance's team uses at his company. There's, of course, Waterfall, which is the old school methodology. So this is all tied to our series on Agile and, all the different ways people do it. Yeah, so that's really why we're exploring this and trying to dive deep into the actual mechanics of Agile and see what people are doing.
Are there any performance reviews in Waterfall? Are there any? Are they just like, it's this big project that we planned and it'll be done when all of these things are done?
Actually, yeah, the only way to go fast is to do it right?
I've never been a part of a waterfall project.
I think, Wayne's question, what happens if business executives tie velocity to performance reviews? What you're going to have is people bloating their velocity. They're going to, what was once a 2-point is now an 8-point, and oh man, our velocity's through the roof. So give me my bonus. And I think you need to be honest with executives about how that works, or else, yeah, it benefits no one trying to put a charade around all this stuff. So,
what about monetary assignments? I've definitely seen that.
Yeah, monetary assignments to the number of lines of code,
or points, or a ticket gets this much value monetary value.
Hey, if organizations find a way to make it work and their employees are happy with the system, there's probably creative ways to do that stuff that are fair and just. I personally haven't seen anything like that.
A lot of factors.
We talked about it extensively, where usually a date is set for delivery before anything is planned or discussed. So like that's the reality of this type of work, is that someone sets a date because it's 3 months out and it seems like we can get this big thing done in 3 months with no real thought or breakdown of what was, what would really take. So yeah, I think this has been a good conversation, guys. I appreciate you taking the time today. Any other final topics or thoughts you guys want to chime in on before we wrap it up here?
I'm just curious about what's part 3, but before you go do that, maybe Tom has something to say.
I was just saying it's okay to do it this way, right? Having another team, assigning these, right? But you just have to, you can't conflate going back to what I said, you can't conflate the team having ownership to the customer, but then actually they're just delivering, features to a team that tells them what to do. So ideally, I think, the best scenario, the best way to do it is that, have that decentralized teams that own that customer value and they're working directly with the customers. And, the hierarchy is another team has assigned that to them, right? But yeah, those are my thoughts. You can't do it this way. You just have to be clear. You just have to be clear about who the customer is and how it's being delegated.
I did have one last comment about the backlog. I think that could have its own 10-minute segment, but the purpose of we don't really have a backlog in our process. I mean, it's sort of there, but we don't revisit it. You have to repitch things.
Mm-hmm.
You have to it's a new context now, so you can't just pull it from the graveyard and decide we can do this now. And then it's interesting, like with our cooldown, that's kind of our, okay, maybe you can pull some extra things from the backlog if you really want to. But yeah, I don't know if this is like the episode to talk about it, but what are your feelings about actually keeping a backlog and what's its purpose?
Yeah, I don't like backlogs. every time I have a rule of thumb that whenever I do have a backlog grooming meeting on my calendar, and part of that meeting is we have to at minimum remove 10% of the backlog every time we go through it and groom it, because if you don't kind of just get rid of the those things that don't have ROI or you're never going to get to, it just grows into this unwieldy beast. So I really like the idea of shape up and kind of not having a backlog, and a pitch is made, and yeah, I get those old pitches kind of going in archive, which is wink wink somewhat of a backlog, but if you're going to revisit a pitch, you got to update it and make sure it's relevant to the current landscape, like you said. So yeah, the best thing you can do with a backlog is say no. Like Wayne just hit the nail on the head. Nope. Slash and burn. If it's not worth doing now, it's not worth it. In most cases, it's not worth doing ever. Well, I want to take this opportunity to thank all our listeners for tuning in to today's episode of Lunch with Tech Leaders. We hope you found the conversation informative and valuable. We'd love to have you join us again next week, where Jason Brown and expert co-hosts are going to discuss the top tools for serverless development, something right up Tom's alley. Be sure to tune in, because it's going to be a raunchy and wild ride. Take care, everyone.
When servers go serverless, do they just get extra wild? Is that how it works?